The collapse begins. Richard Coleman had always believed he was untouchable. He was the man who turned Titan Technologies into one of the biggest tech empires in the world. Every magazine called him a genius, a visionary, a man who could see the future before anyone else. He wore his success like armor, and his fortune, worth billions, was proof of it. But on this morning, all that armor shattered. The massive mahogany desk in his office shook as Richard slammed his fist down. His computer screen glowed red, showing numbers dropping so fast they looked like a waterfall. His empire was bleeding money. $2.9 billion had already vanished. "Sir," Marcus, his head of security, said, his voice tight with panic, "they've breached every firewall. Our entire system is compromised." Richard's chest tightened. Titan Technologies had some of the most advanced cyber defenses in the world. His teams had built walls no one was supposed to climb, but now, those walls were falling, and he couldn't stop it. His phone buzzed nonstop. Board members, investors, journalists, even politicians demanding answers. His inbox filled with angry emails. His empire, built over 30 years, was crumbling in 30 minutes. For the first time in years, Richard felt powerless. Sweat dripped down his forehead, blurring his vision. His hands trembled as he gripped the desk. How did they get in?" he whispered. Marcus shook his head. "We don't know. It's like they knew every weak point before we even did. Sir, it's almost as if they were already inside." The words made Richard's heart drop. Already inside? Betrayal? A spy? His mind raced through every possibility. Behind the glass walls of his office, the employees of Titan moved in chaos. Some shouted into phones, others slammed laptops shut. Fear spread like wildfire. The empire wasn't just losing money, it was losing trust. Richard's daughter's photo sat on the desk, her smile frozen in a silver frame. He glanced at it, his jaw tightening. For years, he had sacrificed family, love, and peace for this empire. Now, everything he had given up seemed meaningless. And then, as he buried his face in his hands, a voice echoed in his mind, something the janitor's little girl had once said when she passed by his office. Sometimes the biggest doors open with the smallest keys. At the time, he had ignored her childish words, but now, with billions vanishing, those words returned, haunting him. The question was, could a 7-year-old really hold the key to saving him? The fall of the Titan. The boardroom smelled of panic. Richard Coleman sat at the head of the long, polished table, his tie loosened, his hair slightly damp with sweat. He had faced many storms before, hostile takeovers, lawsuits, political scandals, but this was different. This was not an attack he could crush with lawyers or silence with money. This was invisible, coming from the shadows of cyberspace, tearing apart everything he had built. 30 executives sat around him, their faces pale as ghosts. They whispered among themselves, eyes glued to the collapsing numbers projected on the wall. Every second, millions disappeared from Titan Technologies' accounts. "Richard," barked Alan Prescott, one of the most influential board members, "we need answers. We need them now. How could this happen? Titan was supposed to be unbreakable." Richard tightened his jaw, feeling their eyes cut into him like blades. He had always ruled this room with authority, his voice final, his word absolute. But today, he had no answers. He glanced toward Marcus, who stood silently at the corner, his hands clenched behind his back. Marcus shook his head slightly, confirming what Richard already knew. There was nothing new to report. They were blind. "Unbreakable?" Richard finally said, his voice colder than steel. "Everything is breakable when the enemy knows where to strike. Whoever did this didn't just hack us. They studied us. They waited for the perfect moment." Silence spread across the room. He could see doubt forming in the eyes of his executives, the same men and women who had once worshipped him, now questioning whether their leader was still fit to command. He hated the look of fear in their faces, but what cut deeper was the glimmer of blame. They wanted someone to carry the weight of this disaster, and it was already clear who it would be. The press was circling like sharks. Crumbled. Ends in the room flashed with live news tickers. Titan Technologies loses billions in Cyberattack. Anchors speculated on television, investors called for resignations, and whispers of bankruptcy filled the air. For the first time in his career, Richard Coleman felt like prey instead of predator. After hours of failed strategy sessions, Richard dismissed the board. He remained in the room alone, staring out the tall windows of the skyscraper that bore his name. The city stretched below him, cars like ants, lights like stars. But tonight, it all looked small, fragile, meaningless. His reflection in the glass looked like a stranger, a tired man, older than his years, drowning in arrogance finally catching up with him. A soft knock pulled him from his thoughts. He turned sharply, expecting Marcus or another executive with bad news. Instead, the janitor, Mr. Alvarez, stepped inside quietly with his cleaning cart. Richard's first instinct was irritation. This was not the time for brooms and mops. But he was too exhausted to say anything. "I'm sorry, sir," Alvarez said softly, his voice respectful. "I'll come back later." Richard waved him in dismissively. "No, do what you have to do. This place is already falling apart. One more sound of a vacuum won't change anything." His voice dripped with bitterness. As Alvarez moved silently around the room, dusting corners and emptying bins, Richard found himself speaking aloud, almost to no one. 30 years. 30 years of building walls around my empire, and one night is all it takes to burn it to the ground. Tell me, how does a man prepare for that? The janitor paused, his eyes kind but cautious. He opened his mouth as if to answer, but before he could, the door creaked again. A small figure peeked inside, his daughter, Sophia. She was only 7, her hair tied in messy braids, her school bag still slung over her tiny shoulders. "Papa," she whispered to Alvarez, "can I sit with you while you finish? It's boring outside." Alvarez hesitated, glancing nervously at the billionaire at the table. Richard looked at the little girl, her innocence cutting through the suffocating weight of the room. For a brief moment, he thought of his own daughter, grown now and distant, living halfway across the world, barely speaking to him. Alvarez nodded to Sophia, and she tiptoed inside, sitting on the floor near the window with a small sketch pad. She began to draw quietly, humming under her breath. Richard tried to ignore her, but the faint sound of her humming made something stir in him. It was a melody his daughter used to hum when she was a child, before the company, before the endless work, before he lost her to his obsession with success. He swallowed hard, forcing his attention back to the financial reports in front of him. But then he noticed Sophia's curious eyes staring at the large projection screen still showing Titan's systems in chaos. She tilted her head, squinting. Then, in the clearest, most innocent voice, she asked, "Why are all the same red letters flashing over and over? Doesn't that mean they're using the same key?" Her words pierced the silence like a gunshot. Richard froze. Alvarez immediately hushed her, whispering, "Sophia, don't bother the man." But Richard's mind had already ignited. Same key, same code repeating. He turned sharply toward Marcus, who had just re-entered the room. "Pull the system logs again," Richard demanded, his voice suddenly alive. "Focus on repeating sequences. Search for patterns, anything that looks like the same key being used." Marcus frowned, confused. "Sir, with respect, we've run 100 diagnostics already. What could a child possibly—" "Just do it," Richard snapped, his fist hitting the table. But in his heart, he wasn't angry. He was terrified. Terrified because he knew deep down that the little girl might have just seen what his army of experts had missed. And as Marcus rushed out to follow orders, Richard Coleman turned toward Sophia. For the first time in a very long time, the billionaire looked at someone not with power or arrogance, but with the faintest glimmer of humility. The child's key. The night dragged on like a storm that refused to pass. Richard remained in the boardroom long after the others had gone, the weight of Titan's collapse pressing down on his shoulders. His expensive suit hung loose on him now, as though the fabric itself had surrendered. The city skyline beyond the glass windows glittered with 1,000 lights, mocking him with their calm while his empire drowned in chaos. Marcus burst into the room with a laptop under his arm, his face flushed with adrenaline. He didn't waste time with formalities. He set the laptop on the table, spun it around, and tapped at the keys furiously. "Sir," he said breathlessly, "I ran the diagnostics again, just like you ordered, and she was right." Richard stiffened. "Explain." Marcus pulled up a stream of data, endless rows of numbers and letters cascading down the screen. To Richard's untrained eye, it looked like meaningless noise, but Marcus pointed at certain red sequences flashing in steady rhythm. "Look here, sir. These intrusions, they're cycling through the same access key over and over. They disguised it with noise, but the pattern repeats. It's primitive, almost sloppy, but so effective that none of us looked for it. We assumed an attack of this scale had to be sophisticated, but sometimes the simplest tricks are the most devastating." Richard leaned closer, his pulse quickening. He glanced at Sophia, who sat cross-legged on the carpet, coloring in her sketch pad, as if the fate of billions meant nothing to her. She hummed softly, swinging her legs in rhythm, her world still simple and untouched. Richard felt a strange mix of shame and awe. How could a 7-year-old child notice what his army of cyber experts had failed to see? Marcus continued, his voice tight with urgency. "If we can trace the source of that repeated key, we might identify the origin of the attack. But there's something else. This repetition suggests they're inside our system, but not fully secured. It means they're rushing. If we act fast, we could isolate them before they extract everything." For the first time in hours, Richard felt a flicker of hope. He straightened, his voice regaining some of its old authority. "Then isolate them, now. Cut every external line they've tapped into. I don't care what you have to shut down. If this is our chance to slow them, take it." Marcus nodded, snapping the laptop shut and hurrying out of the room. The heavy door closed behind him, leaving Richard alone with Alvarez and Sophia once again. The silence that followed was heavy, but not as suffocating as before. Richard stared at the little girl for a long moment, his mind circling back to the words she had spoken. Same key. So simple, so innocent, yet sharper than any strategy his advisors had offered. He found himself speaking not to her directly, but to the space between them. "Do you know what you just did, child? You may have given me the first thread in a tangled net I thought impossible to escape." Alvarez, embarrassed, stepped forward quickly. "Sir, please forgive her. She doesn't understand these things. She was only curious." His voice carried the nervousness of a man who knew how powerful men could be when their pride was wounded. But Richard did not lash out. Instead, he turned his gaze on the janitor, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, something almost human. "She saw what none of us did. Do not apologize for her, Alvarez. Perhaps the eyes of the untrained see more clearly than those clouded by arrogance." The janitor lowered his head, not knowing how to respond. He had worked for Rich, hard for years, invisible like the furniture, useful only when floors needed shining. But tonight, his daughter had done what entire security teams could not. Pride swelled in his chest, though he tried to hide it. Richard rubbed his temples, exhaustion pressing hard against him. Yet beneath the fatigue, a seed of humility had begun to grow. He thought of his own daughter again, a girl who once used to sit on his lap and ask questions about his work, questions he dismissed as childish interruptions. What if she too had noticed things he never allowed her to voice? What if, in chasing billions, he had missed the wisdom in front of him all along? The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Somewhere in the building, Marcus and the remaining tech teams scrambled like soldiers in a battlefield. Every second mattered. Richard remained in the dim boardroom with Sophia, who had now abandoned her sketchpad and wandered to the glowing projection screen. She pointed at the falling numbers again, frowning. "Why is it still red if you already know the trick?" Her question struck Richard like a dagger. He realized that knowing the weakness was not the same as fixing it. They had only uncovered the first layer of the attack. The real war was still raging beneath, and in that moment, Richard Coleman, the billionaire, the titan, the man who had built walls around his life so high no one could touch him, understood something he had never admitted before. He could not win this alone. For the first time in decades, he would have to listen, not just to experts, not just to men with degrees and titles, but to the smallest, most unlikely voice in the room. As Sophia yawned and curled up beside her father's cleaning cart, Richard watched her with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He whispered to himself so softly that no one else could hear, "Sometimes the biggest doors do open with the smallest keys." And though billions were still at risk, for the first time that night, Richard felt the faintest spark of something he thought he had lost forever. Hope, the hidden wound. The early hours of the morning crept into Titan Tower, but Richard Coleman had not slept. His boardroom, once a place of triumph and strategy, had become a war bunker. Screens flickered with streams of code, financial dashboards, and maps of digital traffic. Marcus returned, his face pale, a shadow of sleeplessness under his eyes. He carried with him not victory, but something far more dangerous: information. "Sir," Marcus said, setting the laptop on the desk. "We traced the key pattern back to multiple nodes. They were bouncing signals across the globe: Singapore, Frankfurt, Dubai. But when we peeled away the layers, there was something strange. The core of it, it's here. The origin came from inside our own network." Richard's heart thudded heavily. "Inside? You mean a mole, a traitor?" Marcus nodded grimly. "Not just any mole. Someone with direct knowledge of our architecture. Whoever it is, they had clearance to access the deepest vaults. This wasn't just an outside attack. It was fed from within." The words hung in the air like poison. Betrayal. The kind Richard had always feared but never believed would truly come. His empire was not falling from the outside. It was bleeding from the inside, stabbed by hands he had once trusted. Richard sank back into his chair, his chest tightening. The betrayal hit harder than the billions already lost. His company was not just his fortune, it was his identity. And now, to imagine that someone he had mentored, promoted, or trusted had delivered him into ruin, the thought carved into him like a blade. From the corner of the room, Sophia stirred. She had dozed off for a while, her head against her father's cleaning cart, but the sharp voices woke her. She rubbed her eyes, looked at the screens, and frowned again. "Why are all those names the same?" she asked innocently, pointing to a list of repeating user IDs, feet flashing on the log reports. Marcus blinked. "What?" He leaned over the screen and followed her finger. The IDs were scrambled in code, but to her, the pattern was obvious. They weren't all random, some of the letters repeated too neatly. "Dear God," Marcus whispered, "she's right again. They're using cloned credentials. They didn't just steal access, they made duplicates of actual employees." Richard leaned forward, his stomach dropping. "Cloned? Meaning?" Marcus exhaled. "Meaning, sir, this wasn't a full external hack. Someone inside handed them the first key. After that, they just copied identities like shadows. That's why the breach felt unstoppable, because we were fighting ghosts of our own people." Richard's hands trembled as he pressed them against the desk. His empire had been betrayed not by a faceless enemy, but by someone who had once sat in these halls, shared these corridors, pretended to be loyal. And because of that betrayal, thousands of jobs, livelihoods, and futures were now in flames. He felt a lump rise in his throat, but it wasn't just anger. It was grief. He thought of his daughter again, the one he had neglected in his chase for empire. She had once told him during a rare dinner together, "Papa, you trust your company more than you trust your family." At the time, he had brushed her off with a laugh. Now, as his walls collapsed, he wondered if she had seen the truth long before he did. Sophia watched him silently, her young eyes impossibly perceptive. She held her sketch pad, now filled with drawings of locks, keys, and doors, her child's way of making sense of the chaos around her. She tilted her head and said, almost whispering, "Maybe the person who hurt you was someone who wanted you to look, but you never looked." The words landed like a strike to the chest. Richard froze. They weren't just about the betrayal in his company. They were about his life. How many times had he ignored the small voices, the quiet warnings, the gentle hands reaching for his attention? His daughter's tears, his wife's silence before she left, who had once told him Titan was cracking under his pride, all dismissed, all unseen. And now, a 7-year-old child had pierced the armor he had spent a lifetime building, exposing the truth he had buried under ambition. Richard looked away, gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. His empire might be bankrupt, but what broke him was not the money. It was realizing that in chasing everything, he had seen nothing. Marcus, oblivious to the storm raging inside his boss, continued urgently. Sir, if we can find out whose credentials were duplicated first, we might be able to identify the traitor. But we'll need to shut down half the system, and that means admitting to the press and regulators that we lost control. Richard did not respond immediately. He stared at Sophia, her tiny hands flipping the pages of her sketchpad, her innocence untouched by billions or betrayal. For the first time in decades, Richard Coleman asked himself a question he had never dared to consider. What if his legacy wasn't his empire, but the way he had ignored the people who truly mattered? The billions mattered, yes, but the truth was beginning to matter more. The face behind the shadows. The hours crawled by with suffocating weight. The entire skyscraper seemed to breathe with unease. Phones rang endlessly in the offices below. Lawyers demanded statements, and journalists swarmed the building's front entrance, waiting for a glimpse of the once untouchable billionaire. But in the sealed boardroom, high above the chaos, Richard Coleman sat in a silence so heavy that it pressed on his chest like iron. The glow of the monitors lit his weary face as Marcus returned with new findings, his expression grim and reluctant. Sir, Marcus began, lowering his voice, we've isolated the first clone credential. It belonged to someone in your own executive circle. Richard's eyes narrowed, his wreath sharp. Who? Marcus hesitated, as though saying the name would unleash a curse. Finally, he whispered, Eleanor Hayes, your chief financial officer. The room tilted for Richard. Eleanor, loyal Eleanor, who had been with Titan for nearly 2 decades. She had stood beside him in meetings, defended him during crises, celebrated victories with champagne toasts. Richard's mind scrambled through years of memories, searching for signs of betrayal, for cracks in the armor of loyalty he thought she wore. But he found none. The realization that she had been the one to hand his empire to the wolves sent a raw, searing pain through him, worse than any financial loss. Eleanor? Richard's voice cracked. Why? She had everything. Wealth, power, respect. What more could she want? Marcus's jaw tightened. We don't know yet. But her credentials were the first compromised. She had the keys to the kingdom, and someone, either by force or by choice, used them. Richard leaned back, gripping the arms of his chair, the betrayal slicing deeper with every thought. This was not an enemy storming his gates. This was someone he had invited inside, someone he had trusted as family. Across the room, Sophia looked up from her sketchpad, her innocent eyes studying the billionaire's trembling hands. She spoke softly, with the blunt honesty only a child could have. Sometimes people who smile at you are really crying inside. Her words hit Richard harder than Marcus's report. He closed his eyes, flashes of Eleanor's face playing in his memory. Her tight smiles during board meetings, the way her hands lingered on financial reports as though hiding something, her quiet absence at the last holiday gathering. He had never asked her how she was, never looked beyond the numbers she presented. To him, she was a machine that printed results. To her, perhaps, she was invisible. Marcus broke the silence. Sir, we need to decide how to handle this. If we expose her to the authorities now, we might salvage part of the damage, but it will also confirm to the world that your closest ally betrayed you. The press will tear you apart. Richard pressed his palms together, his mind spiraling. For decades, he had cared about nothing but the image of strength, the illusion of perfection. But now, staring at Sophia, this small child who saw truths hidden from everyone else, he wondered whether protecting an image was worth anything at all. Sophia, sensing his pain, shuffled closer. She held out her sketchpad, turning it toward him. The page showed a crude drawing of a tall figure with a crown, standing on a pile of coins, but with cracks running through his chest. Beside him, a smaller figure, a girl, held out a key, and a beam of light shone through the cracks. Richard's throat tightened as he stared at it. The drawing was childish, uneven, but its meaning was clear. Wealth could build walls, but it could not mend the wounds of the heart. And sometimes the smallest key was not to a lock but to a truth that had been ignored too long. At that moment, Marcus's phone buzzed. He answered quickly, his face hardening as he listened. "Sir," he said after hanging up, "the FBI just confirmed Eleanor is gone. She cleaned out her accounts, vanished hours ago. She knew we were close." The room went still. Richard's head dropped into his hands. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was abandonment. A woman he had believed would stand with him until the end had vanished into the night, leaving him to face the ruins alone. But as despair clawed at him, Sophia's small voice cut through once more. "Maybe she left because you never asked why she was sad." The words cracked him open. More than the billions lost, more than the headlines screaming his downfall, it was that Turi said that he had never seen the pain behind the smiles of those closest to him that broke him. And for the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt his heart truly break the weight of the world. By dawn, the skyscraper that once symbolized Richard Coleman's power had become a fortress under siege. Helicopters hovered above the glass tower, reporters swarmed the entrances, and television screens across the world blared the headline, "Titan Technologies collapses in historic $2.9 billion cyber heist." Analysts speculated on the company's bankruptcy, investors demanded explanations, and ordinary people, many of whom had lost savings tied to Titan stock, cursed Richard's name in anger. Inside the boardroom, Richard sat slumped in his chair, his once razor-sharp suit wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. The weight of betrayal, humiliation, and loss pressed down on him like a mountain. For decades, he had been celebrated as a visionary, a man who conquered the impossible. But now, he was a symbol of arrogance and failure. The empire he had built was not just crumbling, it was being stripped apart in public piece by piece. Marcus stood near the window speaking urgently into his phone with government officials, trying to keep the regulators from storming Titan's headquarters. But his words were frantic, defensive. He was fighting a war with no soldiers left. Richard knew the truth. No matter how many excuses or technical explanations were offered, the world would only see one thing, that a billionaire who believed himself invincible had fallen, and the fall was spectacular. Richard rubbed his face with trembling hands. He had faced enemies before, competitors, politicians, even global markets, but he had never faced himself. He had never sat in the wreckage of his own choices with nowhere to hide. The betrayal of Eleanor cut deeply, but what cut deeper was the growing realization in that her betrayal had only been possible because of the culture he had created. Cold, distant, merciless. People served him, but no one was loyal to him. Richard blinked, staring at her in confusion. The truth will destroy me. They'll tear me apart if they know how badly I failed. Sophia tilted her head, frowning as though she couldn't understand the logic of his fear. But they're already tearing you apart. Maybe if you tell them yourself, it won't hurt as much. Maybe they'll believe you more if you're not pretending. The words, simple as they were, pierced through the fog of Richard's despair. Pretending. That was what he had done for decades. Pretended to be unshakable, pretended to care about nothing but results, pretended that walls of money could shield him from human pain. And where had it brought him? To a boardroom of empty chairs, a company in ruins, and a life stripped of meaning. He looked at Sophia, this janitor's daughter, and for the first time in his life he envied the clarity of a child. She saw what armies of advisors and experts could not, that the only thing left to do was to stop pretending. Minutes later, Marcus returned, his voice sharp. "Sir, the press is demanding a statement. They're gathered outside the tower. If you don't speak, the narrative will bury you alive. I advise crafting a careful, controlled message. Something that buys us time." Richard shook his head slowly, surprising himself. His voice was quiet but steady. No. No more crafted lies. No more pretending. Marcus froze, confused. "Sir?" Richard rose from his chair, straightening his tie with slow, deliberate movements. He looked weary, broken even, but in his eyes was something new, a flicker of resolve that had not been there hours before. "I'm going downstairs," he said. "I'll face them myself." Marcus stared in disbelief. "That's suicide. They'll shred you." Richard looked past him at Sophia, who stood small and steady, her sketchpad clutched like a shield. Then let them, Richard said quietly. Because maybe, for once, it's what I deserve. But they'll hear it from me, not through screens, not through whispers, from me. And so, as the sun rose over the city, Richard Coleman walked toward the storm waiting below. For the first time in his life, he would stand before the world not as the billionaire titan who controlled everything, but as a man stripped bare of his empire. And he carried with him not a speech written by advisors, but the echo of a 7-year-old's words, "Tell the truth." The redemption of a titan. The plaza outside Titan Tower was a battlefield. Cameras flashed like lightning, microphones were thrust forward like spears, and the roar of reporters filled the air with relentless questions. The people who once lined up to praise Richard Coleman now gathered to witness his fall. Anger, curiosity, and hunger for spectacle rippled through the crowd. The billionaire's name had been etched into the city skyline for decades, but now it was being dismantled letter by letter in headlines that screamed his ruin. When the glass doors opened and Richard stepped out, a hush fell over the sea of voices. He looked nothing like the man who had once been portrayed as invincible. His suit was wrinkled, his face drawn with sleepless hours, his eyes shadowed not just by exhaustion, but by the weight of regret. He stood at the podium without a prepared statement, no teleprompters or carefully scripted words. For the first time in his life, he was not the architect of control. He was simply a man, stripped of his empire, standing before the world with nothing left to hide. The reporters erupted. "Mr. Coleman, is Titan finished? Did your CFO betray you? What about the billions lost? Are you stepping down?" Questions hammered him like bullets, but Richard raised a hand not with the arrogance of command, but with the quiet plea of someone asking to be heard. Slowly, the noise died down. When he spoke, his voice was not the booming authority that had once dominated boardrooms. It was raw, unguarded, almost fragile. "For 30 years, I believed I was unbreakable. I built walls of money, of technology, of power, and I told myself they would keep me safe. I chased numbers, not people. I demanded loyalty but never gave it. And in the end, the walls fell, not because of the strength of my enemies, but because of the emptiness inside them." The crowd shifted, Ted uneasily, unused to hearing such naked honesty from a man of his stature. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing every tremor of his hands as he gripped the podium. Richard swallowed hard, his gaze sweeping across the crowd, then landing on a single figure standing near the back. Alvarez, his janitor, with his daughter Sophia at his side. The girl clutched her sketchpad, her braids loose, her innocent eyes watching him with a quiet steadiness that anchored him. Richard felt his throat tighten, but he pressed on. "I was betrayed," he said slowly, "by someone I trusted. But if I'm honest, betrayal did not begin last night. It began years ago, when I betrayed the people who believed in me. When I betrayed my own family, my employees, even myself. I was so blinded by arrogance that I did not see the pain in those around me, and I did not listen to the voices that mattered most." He paused, drawing in a shaky breath. "But last night, in this very building, I was reminded of something I had forgotten. That truth can come from the smallest voice, from the most unexpected place. A 7-year-old girl saw what armies of experts missed. And in her words, I saw not just the key to understanding what happened to my company, but the key to understanding myself." The crowd rippled with murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras capturing every syllable. Richard's voice cracked as he continued. "I cannot bring back the billions that are gone. I cannot undo the pain this collapse will cause, but I can stand here, and for the first time in my life, tell the truth. I was wrong. I was blind. And I will spend whatever years remain to me not chasing more wealth, but repairing what I have broken, starting with the people I ignored for far too long." The silence that followed was profound, the kind that carried weight far heavier than applause. Reporters stared at him, stunned, their microphones lowered. It was not the speech of a titan trying to save an empire. It was the confession of a man finally willing to save his soul. Then, in the quiet, Sophia did something no one expected. She slipped free from her father's hand, walked forward through the sea of reporters, and held up her sketch pad. Cameras swung toward her as she stood beside the billionaire, showing the drawing of the cracked man with a crown and the small figure holding a key of light. Richard looked down at her, his eyes glistening. He placed a hand on her small shoulder, the gesture unplanned but powerful. "This," he said softly, his voice carrying through the microphones, "is the reminder I needed, that sometimes wisdom wears the face of innocence, that sometimes the smallest key opens the biggest door." The crowd, hardened by cynicism, began to soften. Some clapped hesitantly, others lowered their cameras, moved by the sight of a titan humbled by a child. The moment spread across the world in real time, the image of Richard Coleman standing beside a janitor's daughter, a billionaire finally human, finally honest. In the days that followed, Titan Technologies did not recover its billions. The empire continued to unravel, but Richard's words that morning sparked something greater than financial repair. Former employees reached out with forgiveness. Communities he had once ignored began to see him not as a monster, but as a man finally facing himself. And though his fortune was scarred beyond repair, his legacy shifted, from that of a cold empire builder to a man who, in losing everything, discovered the only thing that mattered. As for Sophia, she remained what she had always been, a little girl with a sketch pad humming songs under her breath. But in Richard Coleman's heart, she was more than that. She was the smallest key that had opened the largest door, a door not to money or power, but to redemption. And for the first time in a lifetime, Richard Coleman was free.